Philosophy here is something that goes beyond theoretical formulation or conceptual formulation. The philosophical concepts are very different from theoretical concepts. Philosophy, in this lecture, we are focusing on that goes beyond dominant theoretical formulation or conceptual ontology. The other one philosophical concepts are very different from theoretical concepts. In the context of in this lecture, we are focusing on that goes beyond this lecture dominant theoretical formulation or woven around ontology. The other one philosophical concepts are very different from two German philosophers. In the context of one is in this lecture, we are focusing on Nicholas. That one of this lecture dominant theoretical formulation or woven around ontology. The other one philosophical concepts are very different from two German philosophers. In the context of one is in this lecture, we are focusing on media. That one of this lecture dominant theoretical formulation or woven around ontology. In particular, what we mean by the philosophical concepts are very different from theoretical concepts. In the context of one is in this lecture, we are focusing on media. That one of this lecture dominant theoretical formulation or woven around. In particular, what we mean by the philosophical concepts are very different from theoretical concepts. Technology in the context of optical. What is lecture? We are focusing on media. In one of this lecture, dominant theoretical formulation. In particular, what we mean by the philosophical concepts are very different from theoretical concepts. Technology in the context of optical. What is lecture? We are focusing on media. In one of this lecture, dominant theoretical formulation. In particular, what we mean by the philosophical concepts are very different from technology in the context of optical. What is lecture? We are focusing on media. In one of this lecture, dominant theoretical formulation. In particular, what we mean by the philosophical concepts are very different from dominant theoretical in particular, what we mean by the philosophical concepts are very things in time and space. So, Aristotelian ontology of dominant theoretical in particular, what we mean by the philosophical concepts are very things in time and space. For that usage. So, it doesn't encourage relations between things in time and space. Dominant theoretical in particular, what we mean by the philosophical concepts are very things in time and space. I quote again. So, the very concept of it doesn't encourage relations between related to his theory of dominant theoretical in particular, what we mean by the philosophical concepts are very I quote again. So, the very concept it doesn't encourage relations of writing related to his theory of dominant theoretical in particular, what we mean by the philosophical concepts are very I quote again. So, the very concept it doesn't encourage relations of writing related to the ontology in particular, what we mean by the philosophical concepts are very I quote again. So, the very concept it doesn't encourage relations of writing related to the ontology in particular, what we mean by the philosophical concepts are I quote again. So, the very concept it doesn't encourage relations of writing related to the ontology in particular, what we mean by the philosophical concepts are I quote again. So, the very concept it doesn't encourage relations of writing related to the ontology further in particular, what we mean by the philosophical concepts are I quote again, it shows he doesn't engage in the price further I quote again, it shows he doesn't engage in the price I quote again, it shows he doesn't engage in the price I quote again, it shows he doesn't engage in the price I quote again, it shows he doesn't engage in the price I quote again, it shows he doesn't engage in the price inference the ontology of something that is peculiarly Indian, if they can be considered as media. The macro case of India, if it is very problematic, we can think about moving towards an ontology of media at the level of the macro state. Better still, we can think about moving towards an ontology of media. Think about at the district level or at the village level. An ontology of the second section of this lecture the macro state will provide you. We can think about more thoughts. We can media. Think about by cross-referencing the works of Friedrich Hitler. The second section and Nicholas Luhmann will provide you. We can think about more thoughts. Friedrich Hitler's think about 3 or 4 works would be cross-referenced here. The 2 important works, Friedrich Hitler. The second section are discourse networks, Thus Nicholas Luhmann, 1800 and 1900. More thoughts. Friedrich Hitler's, besides 3 or 4 works towards an ontology of media, the 2 important works, his last 2-volume work are Discourse Networks, Music and Mathematics, 1800 and 1900, is very dense again, and there is no time to engage with towards an ontology of media. This last work of his last 2-volume work, he planned a 8-volume work on Music and Mathematics, and 1900, wherein he goes back again to Greek times. No time to engage with towards an ontology. Now, in this lecture, I am last work of having a preference for he planned a 8-volume major works, Discourse Networks, Music and Mathematics, 1800 and 1900. Where he goes back again to, and these are Greek times. No time to engage. The most remarkable. Now, in this lecture, I am last work of statements by Hitler in these works. He planned a 8-volume major works. The first is very important. 1800 that captures the spirit of the person. And these are, I quote, only that which can be switched, the most remarkable can be switched off. So that is a partial statement. Is very important. The statement can be made complete by adding can be switched off. I quote, only that which can be switched. What it means can be indirectly is switched off. Only that which can be switched off on or switched off exists. So this is about by adding can be switched off. I quote, only that which can be switched off. What it means, Heideggerian effect in Hitler's work. Only that must be familiar with Martin Heidegger's work on beings. So this is and the being is, according to Hitler, something that can be switched on and switched off. You must be familiar with Martin Heidegger. To provide a sad being anecdote of this statement, the being when he was dying is, according to Hitler, in the hospital in something that can be switched on and switched off. And death is about switching off. He doesn't mention this example. This is my example, but I am trying to relate to this anecdote given 2011. And death is about switching off. About his final moments when he asked attendants to switch off. Mention this example. So this media, particularly the optical and technological media, are to relate to media because they can be switched on and switched off. About his final. So earlier I mentioned about switch off the Trinity. So media, particularly the commands, addresses, and data, are to relate to media, and this makes the workings of these three make so media commands, addresses that are data are to relate to media, and switched on and switched off. The workings of these three make interestingly he mentions this in discourse networks. Media commands, addresses that are 1800 and 1900. He doesn't mention it in his later works. In where he engages with computer-based media and database media in detail. He doesn't mention it. The second important later works take on media is this statement. I quote, what remains of people is what media can store and communicate in detail. This is again a partial statement. The second important later works take on media. His philosophy of media and communication is about what media can store. Again, a triad. That is, this is again a partial storage. Take on media. His philosophy, distribution and communication, and about retrieval. Again, a triad. Or creation, storage, and distribution. Distribution and communication. This is how he defines a discourse network. And in our case, we can creation, storage, leverage this to relate to communication networks. Okay. Communication networks. In both cases, we find the origins to be similar, marginally different. They were influenced by, in both cases, we find the origins, Hegel, Kant to be similar. Frankfurt marginally different. Leading philosophers, they were Adorno and Horkheimer by, in both cases, interestingly, the origins, Hegel, Hitler, Kant is deeply influenced by Frankfurt schools, the mathematicians Shannon and Weaver, who get derided whenever I get critical of the North American approach. Hitler is, in my opinion, the bane of communication discipline. The mathematicians Shannon and begins with Shannon and Weaver, but derided. Hitler, whenever I get critical of, sees them as North American approach, guardian angels. In my opinion, the bane of communication, discipline, the mathematician, Foucault, begins with Shannon and Weaver, but derided. Hitler, whenever I get Gumbrecht, sees them again is a German philosopher, guardian angels. In my opinion, the bane of communication, discipline, the mathematician, recollects, begins with Shannon and Weaver, but derided. Hitler, in this way about the genius of Hitler, when Hitler was a German philosopher, a very young man. In my opinion, the bane of Gumbrecht was organizing a conference in the then Yugoslavia. In this way about and the genius of Hitler, when Hitler and Luhmann were attending, and Gumbrecht was, this was long ago, a conference before the breakup of then Yugoslavia. And Gumbrecht here recalls vividly about Luhmann were these brilliant men, and particularly Hitler. This was long ago, a conference before the breakup of then Yugoslavia. Origins, if you are taking a Foucauldian perspective or Deleuzian and Husserlian perspective, are not to be taken seriously. However, men, and particularly Hitler, the sake of understanding. So, let us keep these as Foucauldian perspective or origins or sources of inspiration, are not to be taken seriously. Then dissenters, however, men, particularly Hitler, who provided understanding. Hitler and Luhmann, let us keep these as the points of dissenters, origins or sources of inspiration, or thoughts, not to be taken seriously. Then dissenters, to think loudly about the other side of the story. Hitler and in the first instance, McLuhan points of dissenters, origins or sources provokes Hitler, or thoughts, intellectual provocations to think loudly about, make the other side of the story. Intellectuals possible. In the first instance, and everyday life provocations are pretty meaningless or useless. Intellectual provocations, the thoughts of McLuhan, we are told, were stirred by intellectuals possible. Herald in his works, and everyday life provocations by pretty meaningless or Walter Wong's works, and many others. Likewise, the thoughts of McLuhan also influenced by the thoughts of Hitler, even though Hitler in many places, Walter Wong's works, gets into serious arguments with likewise the thoughts of McLuhan. For instance, the 1964, even though Hitler work of McLuhan, Understanding Media, the Extensions of Man, gets into serious, is sought to be subverted by Hitler, McLuhan. For instance, when he says the 1964, even though Hitler work of McLuhan, something Understanding Media, terrible extensions of man against McLuhan, is sought to be subverted. He pictures McLuhan as a very naive theorist. Says the 1964, how can one understand media? Work of something if terrible, one cannot see McLuhan. Is sought to be what is inside technological media, say such as a television, a radio, one understand media, or computer. Terrible, one cannot. So what is inside cannot what is inside technological media felt, perceived, say such as in the case of our laptops or any technological gadget. We are only told inside any gadget seen, particularly a laptop, perceived, say such as tab or mobile phone as our laptops, two entities or any technology, a software and an hardware. We are only told Hitler becomes a scene, particularly a laptop, loud critic of mobile phone as software, two entities or any technology, and his criticism. We are only told many a time Hitler becomes a went against the critic of mobile phone as software, the largest two entities or any technology, and his criticism OS provider in the world, Microsoft. He has been the critic of running a side campaign against Microsoft all his life. Ever since he started working on this in the world, Microsoft invisible software, and how the invisible software at times side campaign against Microsoft becomes authoritarian. Ever since he started, for instance, something like a BIOS in the world, Microsoft invisible in a OS software is authoritarian. So software any part of side campaign against that denies us becomes authoritarian ever since he started. For instance, something like a BIOS in the world, Microsoft invisible in a OS software is authoritarian. So something like a part of side campaign against that denies us becomes an extension of I. Something like a BIOS. A wheel becomes an extension of OS, leg, authoritarian. So, something in the case of the reverse becomes an extension of I. Something like a BIOS. A wheel becomes an extension of OS, leg, influence opposition. So, that in the case of the media with our sensory perception of I. Hitler has been a wheel becomes working throughout his life, influence opposition to erase human subjectivity, the anthropocentric notions of has been communication, philosophies and theories, influence opposition to erase an interesting and a long-running disjuncture is provided by notions of as being Habermas, philosophies and theories, particularly the famous and interesting Habermas Lumen debates, which started during early 70s. You have another famous German media philosopher, Frank Hartmann, besides Lumen. The dispersals are started, by which I mean during early 70s. The post, you have another famous German media philosopher, Frank Hartmann, Hitlerian studies scholars, who are engaged with whatever Hitler said, and who are also redefining German media philosophy. They are again several, but Hitlerian studies I'm interested in who are Kema, whatever Hitler said, and Winthrop, who are also redefining German media philosophy. The problem with Hitler, again several, also the problem with McLuhan, who are Kema, is not the problem with Walter Benjamin. All these three are victims of their own style, I would say. Again, several, also the problem with short statements, is radical statements, which were meant to provoke, amuse, and discard their own supposition. Short statements and one such supposition appears very early on to provoke in the book Gramophone, Film and Typewriter, which was published in its English version in 1999. And one such supposition appears, I quote, media determine our situation. In the book Gramophone. Now, if you are blindly following this statements logic, you would end up equating Hitler as a, I quote, media a technological determinist. Now, as we have come to following this picture McLuhan as a technological determinist, you would end up equating, it is not so. Hitler was a technological, not determinist, a technological determinist if you read him thoroughly. At the surface level, it appears as one. He appears as one. It is not so. But if you engage with him thoroughly, you find certain arguments which are very deceptive, and these deceptive arguments land us in this one. He appears as one. View of Hitler as a technological determinist. You find certain arguments, and this was revealed by one as a fan of Hitler, Reinhold Martin, an architect, who was saying, and this was in any profession, something determines our situation. Predominantly, an architect. For a teacher, what determines our situation? Is it the blackboard, or is it the smart board? Something determines our situation. Or is it predominantly the timetable? Or is it for a teacher, what determines our situation? Dominant characteristic of the institution? Is it the blackboard, university, or is it the smart board? Or is it the intellectual, predominantly the timetable? Or is it the profile of the teacher? Or the thought patterns of a particular teacher? Martin says, in his case, architecture, building something, building buildings, the dominant material that determines the lives of architects and construction work-related people is steel. So if you are going to relate to Hitler's statement, media determine our situation in this way, you end up getting away from a stereotypical picture of Hitler as a technological determinist. And that also becomes easy if one gets a reasonably good philosophical profile of him. Who is he? Who was he? What was he? In my opinion, he was a neo-Hegelian. The dominant characteristic of the Hegelian prism is the spirit, the supreme, one that grows to an ultimate state of existence, both at the individual level, at the collective level. In the case of Hitler, if we are going to picture him as a neo-Hegelian, like Hegel, he is pushing higher and higher the status of technological media to the highest possible level, where erasure of the media happens. Erasure of human beings who have come to use the media happens, according to Hitler himself. So he was very fond of recollecting what Foucault writes towards the end of The Order of Things, where he says that the image of the man etched on the beach sand will become a reality. Man will be erased. So in Hitler's case, he is inspired by what Foucault said. In Foucault's case, the reason he was alluding to this possibility of erasure of man, just as something that has been etched on the beach sand gets washed away by the tide, the reason he was mentioning is this, that the man as constructed by the symbolic structures, particularly language, particularly the natural sciences, all these will be erased. In universities, we repeat examinations, we repeat lectures, we repeat classes, we repeat semesters. So repetitions define infrastructures such as universities, schools, government, media organizations, buildings. In a large building or in a large campus, there are repetitions. These repetitions are meant to make us secure in terms of what is to be inside, what is to be outside. Okay. A campus is a space. A building is a place. Both the campus and the buildings are about repetitions in terms of how this outside is managed by the inside and how the inside is managed by the outside. Okay. So it is not only repetition, but basically, in the case of cultural techniques, what the German media philosophers argue is what allows certain things inside, what are rejected from outside. More importantly, as I said, cultural techniques are about repeating many things many times. A farmer plows multiple times. Okay. A farmer, when he gets religious or when he gets philosophical about the soil, he also uses a plow to make certain marks on the land. He also divides his farmland into the sacred and the not so sacred. So boundaries are set up. Boundaries are set up in such ways that they enable the farmer to repeat certain acts. In our houses, we have toilets. Toilets cannot be toilets if they cannot repeat the acts of flushing. All of us are used to driving car or some vehicle, and they have engines. They repeat certain movements. At the largest macro level, universal level, we have the climate systems which repeat rains, summers, and winters. In German media philosophy, cultural techniques refer to what makes possible the distinctions between the outside and inside. So we have to take seriously the doors, windows, the walls, and many other things as unconventional examples. The conventional examples are symbolic systems such as reading, writing, mathematics, music, and imagery. These are the conventional examples given by the Berlin scholars. I'm not sure how long I can go, maybe for another 15 minutes. I will try to introduce more of German media philosophy in terms of the major works. We will wind up shortly with Hitler after this. Hitler compares, I said, Lacanian stages with gramophone, film, and typewriter. For Hitler, the gramophone provides some context to relate Lacanian real, because gramophone captures what cannot be captured by the consciousness. Real is, in the Lacanian sense, something that cannot be symbolized. Okay, consciousness cannot be symbolized. And gramophone intervenes here by recording the auditory reality, okay, which is impossible for human perceptions and consciousness to record. The imaginary stage where the child seeks to get a whole identity is compared with what film provides. Film provides these images of fantasy and images that are otherwise non-existent in reality. The symbolic, of course, is tied with typewriter. The typewriter is about language. Typewriter is about a symbolic environment, and that is associated with language. To understand better this notion of cultural techniques in media philosophy, let me introduce one often cited example. There was a very famous American statesman and intellectual, Thomas Jefferson. Here you are seeing Thomas Jefferson's dining room in the state of Virginia. And this dining room is on the first floor. And on the ground floor, you had the slaves trying to prepare the food, trying to arrange the wine bottles, and send them upstairs through a very peculiar contraption called dumbwaiter. It is doing the function of a lift, a small lift. Why this was seen as necessary by Thomas Jefferson, who designed it? Because he was having conversations which were private, not meant for the slaves to be heard. Slaves should not hear what Jefferson and his friends were talking, what they were discussing. There has to be a wall between these two. Of course, there is a physical division because one is first floor, another is ground floor. But this is not enough. The slaves should not pollute what was happening in the first floor. So the job of the slave is to put the wine bottles and the food in the small lift which goes up and which comes down with empty bottles and empty plates. Now, this is an infrastructure very similar to university. This is an infrastructure very similar to government organizations or any building. So what is the purpose of an infrastructure? The purpose of any infrastructure is to permit certain cultural techniques to operate. So here we must not confuse ourselves with conventional meanings of infrastructure. Infrastructure is not about the physical buildings. Infrastructure is not about the physical elevator. The infrastructure is the virtual thing that permits the cultural technique to operate. Alongside, we also need to remember that German media philosophers were not the only ones to engage with some of the concepts, particularly cultural techniques. We had another brilliant scholar who had a brilliant career, a brilliant life journey, and his name is Bernard Stiegler. He died in 2020. He lived a short life. Short life in the sense around 60 plus years. His life is inspiring because he was a communist. So he was roaming the streets of France as a communist. He participated in the 1968 Second French Revolution. Thereafter, he worked as a manual laborer. Thereafter, he worked as a farmer. He worked as a shopkeeper during 1970s. He was caught in an armed robbery. Okay, so from a communist, he becomes an armed robber. In 1978, he was put in prison for nearly 5 years between 1978 and 1983. He comes out of the prison. He did exhibitions between 87 and 88. And towards the end, he starts his own alternative philosophy school in 2010. And what is his major contribution? His major contribution is in the form of a book titled Techniques and Time. It is a 3-volume book series. And for the first time, he makes clear certain confusion about techniques, that is TECHNIQUES, and techniques, that is TECHNICS, and technology. For Stickler, techniques is a condition of culture and memory. It is not about the technology, it is about how we experience the tools. What are the tools which shape human experience? So, here again, we can redefine our notion of cultural techniques. Finally, the last section here deals with another German media philosopher, Niklas Luhmann, who lived between 1927 and 1998. While Hitler was a neo-Hegelian, Luhmann was a neo-Kantian, non-normative critic, like Hitler. Like Hitler, he was also a radical critic. So, what we must appreciate in German media philosophy is their contra logic of whatever we have come to accept in communication studies or in many disciplines of social sciences and humanities, where we have located human beings at the center of everything. Okay. And last few years, we are seeing in many international conferences works on anthropocentric views of our contemporary life. Okay, so we blame it on anthropocentrism. Many things. Okay, climate change is bad because of what humans have done to Earth. Okay, so we have come to blame many things on the central location of human being for the last several centuries. And these two philosophers are completely disregarding the role and functions and position of human beings. So to them, human beings are at the end of their erasure. Okay, as Foucault said, human beings are in a state where they are no different from images drawn by a child on the beach sand. The tide will wash them away. So Luhmann is famous for his systems theory and also his work on mass media. Now, in journalism classes, we are introduced to journalism in terms of news value parameters. Okay, and these are reconceptualized by Luhmann as news selectors. So we have at most 3 or 5 news value parameters. Okay, proximity, topicality, so on and so forth. But in the case of Luhmann, he has something like 10 news selectors. What is more interesting in his work on reality of mass media is his distinction between or his subversion of what is communication and information. Now, in communication classes, if we are taking a process-centric view of communication, we say communication is a process and information is what goes into the process. But what Luhmann says is information is of two kinds. Communication is not communication. Okay, that is woven around information. Communication, again, in communication classes is about sharing, conveying, all those things. For Luhmann, communication is not about sharing, conveying, or dissemination. Communication for him is about interpretation. For Luhmann, communication is what is known to be known. So his fundamental parameter is what is known to be known is information, What is not known to be known is non-information. So there are two kinds of information related categories. One is information, that is what is known to be known, and what is not known to be known. If a media organization for certain reasons is not putting out certain information out according to its policy, it is not known to be known. As I am giving this lecture, we no longer have the distinction in India. Once upon a time, when I was a journalism student, we were introduced to journalism. We were introduced to two categories of newspapers. Okay, party newspapers and non-party newspapers. Okay, Luhmann talks about information and non-information. During 80s, when I studied MA Journalism and Communication, I was told by the teachers that there are party newspapers and non-party general newspapers. The non-party general newspapers are owned by independent families, of course, with certain affiliations to businesses and politicians. After 40 years, I can say confidently that there are only party newspapers in India. There are no non-party newspapers. Every newspaper or every media in India is having a political affiliation. Once upon a time, it was a business affiliation. So that's why I often refer to death of journalism in India. Okay, death of journalism in different countries is different. Death of journalism in India or in Tamil Nadu, where I am working, is something completely different. It cannot be generalized. Death of journalism as a topic cannot be generalized. So there are very many local examples at the village level, at the town level, at the district level, at the state level. So I find death of journalism in my state, Tamil Nadu, because over the past 20, 30 years, we have lost distinction between party newspapers and non-party newspapers. Journalism always valued this distinction between what is to be known and what is not to be known. I'm not interested in knowing through my party newspaper something else. As a party worker, I am interested in knowing only about my party. If I was reading a general newspaper 30, 40 years back, I was interested not in party matters. I was interested in non-party matters. So this distinction is lost in Tamil Nadu and India. And at this juncture, we need to remember these categories of information and non-information. Now, we are fascinated by Noam Chomsky. Okay, Noam Chomsky continues to be the voice of dissent in say he is the conscience keeper. Okay, so he must be applauded. The likes of Chomsky have to be applauded, no doubt. So his famous work, along with the co-author, is manufacturing content. But what I miss in reading Chomsky's work is the reference to manufacture of concept. There is only a subtle difference. In Public Opinion 1922 by Walter Lippmann. So Walter Lippmann was the first one to make a statement about manufacture of consent. In Chomsky's work, it is manufacturing consent. Yeah, I'm sorry, there was a interruption again. So I was talking about Chomsky's work on manufacturing consent and Walter Lippmann's work on public opinion. Walter Lippmann was the first to refer to manufacture of consent, not manufacturing consent, which was appropriated by Chomsky as manufacturing consent. Here, Luhmann talks about media manipulation, not as the problem imposed by the outsiders, but it is a problem imposed by the intra-system functions. So we get suspicious about manipulation because of the perceived effects or perceived influences or interferences from the outsiders. But according to Luhmann, it is the problem of the internal systems. Okay, so when journalism is dying, you cannot expect media to be free of manipulations. Okay, the internal systems have collapsed. Okay, fairly well. So journalism is no longer journalism. If journalism is no longer journalism in India, uh, it is becoming a site of something else. So it is becoming a site of manipulation. It is becoming a site of business, commerce, advertising, and many other things which are to be seen as non-journalism. Journalism has become a site of non-journalism. To use his categories of, to paraphrase his categories of information and non-information. More interestingly, he sees media as sites of irritation. Media are sites of irritations because we are using media as tools of second order observation. So he introduces us two things. One is first order observation. Okay, I am traveling to a beautiful scenic place as a tourist. I am seeing a lake. I am seeing birds. I am seeing a blue sky. Okay. In CUTN, I admire the blue skies. I admire the sounds of the birds. So this is first order observation. Okay. Now, if some blogger is going to visit CUTN or visit the tourist places and take a video of these places, do editing, clever editing, post on Instagram, then that becomes a site of second order observation. So media are sites of second order observations. Because they are sites of second order observation, they are also becoming restless site. They are introducing this restlessness or irritation in us. I'll skip this. So he links these two with the notion of modernity. So modernity emerges, according to Luhmann, because of these struggles between first order observation and second order observation. Once upon a time, say before photography emerged as a technique, we had only first order observation. Okay, our ancestors went to only these beautiful temples, beautiful lakes, and saw. There was no second order observation. Now we are in the age of so many technological media. We are also burdened by the second order observation when we watch something. We watch something on Instagram first and use first order observation later. Okay, so this is very ridiculous. Okay, so for instance, in many cases, we read food reviews on Instagram and visit the hotel. So our first order observation is corrupted by the second order observation. Okay, so there is a huge problem here. Okay, because of the technological media. So while Hitler doesn't mention this, Luhmann also doesn't mention this, but I am thinking aloud and trying to use his take on modernity, his take on first order and second order observation to connect you with how we can read social media based observations. Okay, so our social media observations are corrupting our first order, what are supposedly our first order observations. Moreover, because we are getting the first observation from social media, here we have a problem. What is first order? What is second order? My social media based observation is a first order. Okay, actually it is anti first order, but it is my first experience about something, about a restaurant. It is my first virtual experience about something. So this virtual experience becomes the first order experience. Once upon a time, it was a non-virtual physical experience. Okay, so we have three orders now. The real first order, the second order, the virtual first order. So this is my take. This is not Luhmann's take. I am thinking aloud with Luhmann's category. I repeat, in the context of social media observations, we have the real first order, the second order provided by the social media, and the virtual first order provided by the social media. So when I watch a food review in social media, that is the virtual first order. Then I go and visit the restaurant. That is a physical first order. And more social media posts on the same hotel, they provide multiple second order observations. So there are multiple first orders, multiple second order observations. So here, numbers become meaningless. What is first, what is second, what is third has to be linear. Okay, mathematics is about linearity at its very basic core. Okay, 1 plus 1, 2 plus 2. Okay, so it has a linear progression, first, second, third. But in this case, particular case, in this take of mind on Luhmann's version of first order, second order, it becomes multiple first orders and multiple second orders. So this is how we in communication need to appropriate both Kittler and Luhmann. Okay, we are approaching the end of this lecture, and an interesting debate happened between Luhmann and Habermas. This has been a long drawn one. Habermas is still living. He has crossed 95 years, but Luhmann is not living. Okay, so when Luhmann was living, they both had intellectual debates on what they agreed with and what they disagreed with. Now, Habermas, as you know, was one of the key thinkers of the Frankfurt School. Okay, not of the same order as Adorno and Horkheimer, but he was trying to keep alive the Frankfurt School spirit. Okay, so he was for freedom, he was for democracy, he was for enlightenment, he was for the success of reason, all those things. And Luhmann disagreed with Habermas on all this. Both Kittler and Luhmann were having no sympathies for Frankfurt School or cultural studies school or anyone who talked about human development or human enlightenment or human reason. Okay, so Habermas was always arguing for communicative rationality. Luhmann was arguing for system rationality. Systems matter a lot. Systems are self-organizing. So there is an economic system, there is a legal system, there is an education system. So all these systems make our society. Society is the largest possible system, and that system has subsystems. Here, human beings have no role. Systems are made by systems. They are not made by human beings. Okay. Habermas was for social consensus. Frankfurt School and Birmingham School and many other schools were for taking everyone into the fold. Okay, so society for them meant consensus. For Luhmann and Kittler, it is to be ignored. You can't take everyone on board the ship. For Habermas and many others, Frankfurt School scholars, personal agency is powerful. As a teacher, I have personal agency. I don't have impersonal agency. for Kittler and Luhmann, the impersonal agency is powerful because we are governed by the systems. Okay, you think of this film matrix. Okay, so matrix gets us this contestation between personal agency and impersonal agency. Okay, any science fiction film is about the struggle between personal agency and impersonal. What comes to my mind is Stanley Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey, where HAL 9000 computer takes over the spaceship and it kills few human beings because all of them fail before the impersonal agency of HAL 9000 artificial computer. Now, our AI world is moving towards an age where the impersonal agency of the system will take over the personal agency of the human beings. Okay, so we can use Luhmann extensively in AI-related studies on communication. Okay, that is one example. Individual autonomy was valued by Birmingham School and Frankfurt School and many other schools. The lesser known schools are many. We don't teach in universities in India. One is the Budapest School, where George Lukács is followed enormously. Okay, there is a very famous scholar in Budapest School by name Agnes Eller. Okay, so she needs to be brought into discussions whenever we discuss German media philosophy. So for Frankfurt School, the individual autonomy mattered a lot. Here, social autonomy matters a lot. And Luhmann's concept is autopoiesis, where he looks at the communication in a completely different angle. For him, communication is not an open system. For many of us in communication department, communication is about openness, opening out, sharing, all those things. Radically, he says communication is a closed system. I quote, that creates the components out of which it arises through communication itself. So communication is a closed system according to Luhmann because there is nothing outside communication. There is only what is inside communication. There is nothing outside communication. So what drives communication is what is inside communication. It is not this camera, it is not the laptop, it is not something else that is outside. So what drives my lecture is autopoietic. So it is a self-regulated one. Okay. So communication is closed system. Communication, as I said earlier, is interactive. It is not about sharing or something else. Now, we have almost reached the end of the lecture, wherein I have my own critique of German media philosophy. Whenever you read a particular kind of philosophy, you like Kittler, as Kittler critiqued Aristotle, as Luhmann critiqued Habermas, as Habermas critiqued Luhmann, okay, as Walter Benjamin critiqued Adorno, as Adorno critiqued Walter Benjamin. Okay, we need to critique to learn more about a particular philosophy. Philosophy is to be seen as a friend of the philosopher. To paraphrase Deleuze and Guattari, concepts of the philosophical kind, not concepts of the theoretical kind. There are two kinds of concepts in my opinion. In academia, we are outside philosophy departments. We are more used to theoretical concepts. But in philosophy, we are not worried about theoretical concepts. Agenda setting is a theoretical concept. It's not a philosophical concept. Circuit of culture is a philosophical concept. Cultural technique is a philosophical concept. Known to be known is a philosophical concept. Discourse network is a philosophical concept. Communication network is an abstract, conceptual, theoretical concept. Internet network is an abstract, conceptual, theoretical concept. So what I'm doing here is how we can critique the German media philosophy. German media philosophy, like many other philosophies which have a bearing on communication, it is about certain tropes such as modernity. Modernity is a trope. It cannot escape this trope. If you are working with modernity, then you talk about postmodernity. If you are working with modernity, you end up talking about pre-modernity. It is a prison. You enter a prison, there are multiple rooms. To get out of the rooms, you have to get out of the prison. Okay. So what is inside these prisons, particularly in Western philosophy, for the last 100, 200 years? So you have rooms such as modernity, pre-modernity, post-modernity, liquid modernity, this modernity, that modernity, etc. In my opinion, it is a prison. I also was fascinated by what appeared as a palace, which was actually a prison. So last 10 years, I have given up completely my engagements with this trope of modernity, post-modernity, etc. Second trope is, again, a Western trope. We are in communication, very enamored of these tropes: orality, print, analog media, digital media, etc. So these are categories. Any category is about identity. Any identity is about identity politics. Okay, so that's why we need to read Deleuze and Guattari a lot. Understand? We need to read Foucault a lot, because to get away from this categories-based identity politics in academic research. Again, the other three categories are culture, society, and system. Can't we think about something better than culture? Can't we think about something better than society? When I say better, can't we think about something meaningful than culture? Now, here again, they are using culture technique or cultural technique. In cultural studies, we had enormous fascination with things culture or cultural. We all know that it cannot be defined, it cannot be delimited. So there are many more meaningful entities other than culture, other than society, other than community, other than systems. For how long, how many decades we in academia are going to work with these tropes? Then, in Western philosophy, they can't do without Hegel, Kant, Marx, Lacan. Okay. So for them, the ancestor worship is very important. When we do ancestor worship, we are ridiculed in India. Okay. So if I am, say, trying to read Kani and Pungundanar differently, so colleagues would think, why this guy is talking about Sangam literature again and again? What is there in Sangam philosophy? So when I wrote a book on spatialities and materialities in communication in South India, I was made to think about why we need a similar kind of ancestor worship, but with a certain rationality, not in a linear order. So in that book, I made Kaniyan Pungunanar to collide with or to oppose Hegel or Marx. So it was not a sole existence of Kaniyan Pungunanar. Kaniyan Pungunanar was co-living with Western philosophers like Hegel, Marx, Walter Benjamin. Understand? But in the West, because they still continue to be supremacist. Okay, for many of the scholars, I'm sorry to say, they should not mistake, the countries outside their countries do not exist. Not in terms of geography, they know such countries exist. An Indologist in Japan or Germany or USA would not know Tamil Nadu exists, or within Tamil Nadu, Thiruvarur exists. For them, South India exists, India exists. Understand? Just as for us, Germany exists, Saxony doesn't exist, Humboldt doesn't exist. So we have all fallen victims to certain kind of racism, that is geographical racism made possible by geographical and cultural distance. Okay, it is not our fault. In the age of very heightened air travel, the majority of the people in the world do not. Who exists where? Okay. So these are familiar tropes. Again, in communication, we are enamored of the implications of the First and Second World War. And Hitler was the one who profited enormously by this fascination with wars and technologies, war histories and media history. For Hitler, media histories are about war histories since American Civil War. So he says with reason, with examples, that American Civil War got us some technologies. Okay, Remington, who manufactured the typewriters, a famous manufacturer of typewriters, were once upon a time during American Civil War gun manufacturers. The gun manufacturer becomes typewriter manufacturer. Understand? So in First and Second World War, radio got installed in tanks, particularly in Second World War. Hitler installs radio receivers in tanks. So Hitler says famously in one place, the use of technology happened during war. The abuse of technology got us entertainment. So our present entertainment media have their origins since American Civil War, First World War, Second World War. So these are some of the other commentators on Hitler and Luhmann. Hitler and Luhmann are also seen as post-humanist because they were anti-anthropocentric. I don't believe in this prefix post, so nothing can be post. But those philosophers who always picture end of something, they always locate themselves firstly with the end of human being. Not human being in the physical sense, the human subjectivity. For them, the human subjectivity becomes a threat. For Hitler and Luhmann, many German philosophers, the human subjectivity is the problem. What could be the reason? Because Hitler had a tremendous personal agency, in my opinion. German media philosophy is going in this way because of a certain distress on the personal agency of villains like Hitler and what Germany went through both during the First World War, Second World War. And also before that, when Germany and Japan were having this expansionist policy. Okay, the first two nations which wanted to occupy the entire world were Japan and Germany. So in both the countries, you find philosophies not getting into the stage of takeoffs or getting into the stage of takeoff in a very problematic way, in a confused way. Okay, so my reasoning or my reason for the interpretations of Hitler and Luhmann against human subjectivity is because of what Germany went through during the First World War and Second World War. I thank everyone who have been listening to me patiently despite the interruptions and despite the denseness of the topic today. I thank all of you once again for joining. I thank my dear young scholars and colleagues, Dr. Bhupalakrishnan, Dr. Shamla, and Ramdar and Dhananjay, and professors of CUTN, Professor Sengadir and Javagar, young scholars who joined this session. Thank you so much. There is more we can learn from these German media philosophers. Philosophy is the need of the hour in communication studies at a time when we are misreading media, particularly in India. Thank you so much. There is a lot more we can do with philosophy to make communication studies intellectually stimulating.